Hello everyone, I'm Rich Boever. I'm a Redemptorist, and I'm working for the year at the Shrine of St. John Neumann in Philadelphia. And the reason I've done that is because I started with St. John Neumann back in my days when I was getting my PhD in historical theology. And the only reason I went with him was basically because the dissertation had to be original material. And I knew we had an archives with all his writings, etc. So that's what got me going. Then as I got going with him, this was, I received my degree back in '83, so this was in the early '80s, late '70s. And then as I've gotten to know him more and more, I've gotten to know him as a person and like him very much. So I'm very pleased to be able to say a few words about John Neumann and the Immigrant. And I do say Neumann. Some people are saying Neumann, which makes sense because Cardinal Newman is maybe St. John Neumann also, and it could be a confusing time. Actually, I did work at Neumann University, NEW, in Wichita, Kansas, which is sponsored by the Sisters Adorers of the Precious Blood. I was a theology professor out there for a while and chaplain, so I enjoyed it out there. So I would like to just begin today, and I just want to say a prayer before we start. Father, you always see the needs of your people, and in compassion, you empower each of us to bring your love where it is most needed. As we continue to hear your invitation, come with me into the fields, help us to respond joyfully and generously to your journeying people. May our worry never be how weary our arms grow, nor how thin our shoes become, but rather let us always be concerned that we are sent as Jesus was sent, in the power of the Spirit, to free the oppressed and to give new life to all your people. Amen. So today we're looking at St. John Neumann in a specific aspect, and that is the immigrant and John Neumann, who himself was an immigrant. And I always say it's kind of like a diamond ring. If we don't, most of us don't have diamond rings, but if we did, one of the things you would do is kind of twist it to the light so the different facets would pick up a specific aspect of the ring. And today we're looking at that facet of John Neumann as an immigrant himself and as a person who lived and worked with immigrants in his life. It seems like migration is part of human history. If you've ever heard the story of ancient peoples, you know that they had to migrate because of ice ages that forced them to find new hunting grounds, and that was a necessity. They had to find a new hunting ground, or perhaps an invading army came into their territory and forced them to move on. We know of this in various histories of ancient peoples. And then, of course, there's always the fact that sometimes people get to the point where economic necessity forces them to leave the homeland and to go to a new place. Well, the history of migration is important in any nation's history, but it is particularly important in the aspect that we are considering in this little talk on St. John Neumann and the immigrant. John Neumann decided to be an immigrant, and he did it in a time before people in Bohemia, where he was from, emigrated to the United States. But while he was in the seminary, he was very intrigued with the missionary journeys of St. Paul. And the professor was good. And you know how a professor can affect the student. Got the student interested in being a missionary. But from the United States at the time, there was a man writing back in the papers that were published, a man named Frederick Barraga, who became eventually the Bishop of Marquette, Michigan, who worked with the Indians and wrote back. And so there became this great fantasy in Europe and in this seminary of working with the Indians in this primitive land called the United States. And Neumann decided in the second year of the seminary that he was going to be a missionary. He was very happy in this little seminary where he was in a town called Budweis. Now it's called České Budějovice because it's part of the Czech Republic. And of course, the name went to Czech instead of German. Well, he decided to become a missionary, so he transferred to the seminary, the Archiepiscopal Seminary in Prague, and just to learn languages, French and English, he thought would be necessary. Well, when he got there, French was forbidden. The Archbishop said, you don't need to learn French. It's the language of the Enlightenment. The French Revolution was not very far behind, and they didn't want those ideas influencing the seminarians, so French was verboten. And then they found out they didn't even teach English. So his whole purpose in going there was defeated, but he wasn't defeated. It seems like he should have been, because at the end of the time of doing all his studies, the bishop of his home diocese in Budweis said, we don't need you. We don't need any priests this year. We have more than enough. And so we're not ordaining anyone. Go home. So he went home waiting ordination. Finally, he says, I got to go. So he headed out. And he headed out without any information of what was going to happen. Headed out across the Atlantic. It took him 40 days. He calls it his time in the desert. Just like Jesus spent 40 days before the ministry, so he did. He went, arrived in New York, had $1 in his pocket, no one to meet him, no destination to go to. He was a typical immigrant. I just want to bring that up first. He wandered the streets. He didn't know anybody. He didn't know what he had to do. He just had a dream. A dream. And for him, of course, the dream was not a money, but a portfolio for eternal life. And so he went from place to place. When he got to finally after 2 days, got to the cathedral, there was a bishop. I pronounce his name Dubois, but the locals seemed to call him Du Bois. He was the bishop of New York. New York at the time had the entire state of New York. And the bishop said, you're going to be ordained. Well, he didn't know that when he came over. Neumann didn't have any idea what was going to happen. In a couple of weeks, the bishop ordained him and sent him out to what those days was the frontier, the area north of Buffalo. There were 3 priests in the entire West around the Buffalo area. Buffalo had 1 priest, Father Pox. There was a guy south of Buffalo, Father Metz, who at the time was in Europe gathering funds. And the entire region above north of Buffalo up to the Niagara Falls was Neumann's parish. There were about 300 German families in the whole area, and he had 4 churches. He went back and forth. He discovered what J. Dolan mentioned in his book, In the Immigrant Church, that J. Dolan says, like adolescence with its spurts, the task was to stay alive and develop correctly. Immigrants were pouring into the United States at this time. Okay? We have some numbers which are just fantastic. 4,370,000 immigrants arrived in the United States, primarily in those days from Ireland or Germany. Those were the 2. And many of them were Catholics, so the task was to stay alive and develop correctly. As such, when you see the work of the early apostles of those days, and this is, of course, your own foundresses, John Neumann and other people like that, you will see that they had to take care of the immediate needs. And so we're not going to find a theology among the ministers of those days that we would find much more developed in these days, and that is that much of the work of ministry of working with immigrants is to be systemic. It's the old story, that you've heard 1,000 times of give the man a fish and he's not hungry today, teach him to fish and he's not hungry tomorrow. Well, I think that at least as far as I can see in my congregation, the men who work in the ministry of with immigrants are much more interested in systemic change. But in those days, they had to take care of what was necessary for today. That's the only thing that they could do. And so they had this thing that what was divine providence teaching them. And in the case of your own sisters, what was, you start as taking care of sick people, and then one day you get these books that tell you you're going to go teach in schools, and then you're going to go to this school, and no, we're not ready for that school because there's a death, and you got to do this. And you have to stay very alert in those days, especially to divine providence and where it was leading you. We also know, because it's so prevalent, of course, in your community, that at the time Catholics were pouring into the country in the form of immigrants. And there was a major change, because in the beginning of the 1800s, there were about 25,000 Catholics in the United States. It was an insignificant denomination. Now, popery was always considered lousy, okay? But it was insignificant. By the time of the Civil War, there were so many Catholic immigrants that came into the United States that by that time, the Catholic population of the United States became the first and most prominent and the largest denomination. So what comes with that? Hatred. Hatred. Because it was going to be a foreign takeover. And of course, what happens when these people come to the United States? They don't come normally because they're successful. They come because they have to find a new life. They have to find a new life. They're poor. And so you have these neighborhoods filled with poor people. And the immigrant is not very popular. And not only is he and she not popular among the nativists, those who consider themselves the American people, who have been immigrants long enough that they forgot their immigration, but the Catholics who had become established before all these immigrants, what happened, there were so many moving in that it changed the color and the flavor of the Catholic Church, and it looked foreign. And people didn't like it. Abraham Lincoln made the comment in 1855. This is a quote. Abraham Lincoln says, "As a nation, we began declaring that all are created equal. We now practically read it, all are created equal except Negroes." He went on to say, "When the know-nothings obtain control, it will read, all are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics." So he put his finger on a problem that is part of our history, and part of the history, certainly, of your community, with the husband of the foundress possibly having been let to die by the know-nothings in the construction. There seems to be this kind of thing that takes place where the local people are filled with hatred. Opposition was from the nativists, the know-nothings, and we know that right here in this city, churches were burned. I can see one out from the roof of the house I live in, St. Michael's, right down the street. I see another one that I passed on the way here, St. Augustine's, burnt to the ground. It was a serious issue. And they could do very little except try to stay alive. When John Neumann came to the United States, his first desire was to work with the Indians, but it didn't happen. And so he said, I agree with this Father Alexander, who wrote back to the superiors, a Redemptorist, who also wanted to work with the Indians, who wrote back, said, for every 100 Indians that are converted, 1,000 German Catholics fall away from the church because they have no one to minister to them. That touches what's happening today. How many are going to fall away from the church, immigrants, because they have no one to work with them? For John Neumann, this became an issue, and rather than saying we're going to change the whole system, he says, how can we do this? He suggested, he was a lonely diocesan priest in Buffalo. He wrote back and says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to set up a little community here. And you come on and live here. You can live with me, and you can adjust to the new surroundings, and you'll be an immigrant worker in the future. Well, it never went anywhere. Later on, when he was a Redemptorist, he wrote back and tried to start a seminary to train priests specifically to be missionaries in the United States. That neither happened. But what you do when you enter into this kind of a work and this kind of a history is you keep looking, what can I do to take care of this problem? The urgency of the moment is so major, and you just keep on working. You take care of the sick. I think that it is beyond any doubt that the reason that the faith in the United States is still so firmly rooted rests, if you look at the history of these days, of John Neumann's days, rest with women religious. Now, they were clergy, they were good and wonderful men, but they were out in a parish, and they were growing up so fast. In John Neumann's day, they established 100 churches, okay, when he was bishop here in Philadelphia. The priest had to be out there, take care of the needs, the pastoral needs of the local parish. But who took care of the whole Catholic people? Mainly the religious, and primarily the women religious. Hospitals, schools, orphanages, all the works of charity that had to be done were done because of the dedication of these people. And the person of faith, you see, in those days, and I think it's still true today, the person of faith is the entry point of the providence of God in the world. So we have to theologize a little bit about this. Because providence chooses for us almost more than we choose for ourselves what has to be done. Romano Guardini, you may have heard of him. I don't know where he is today. I don't even know if he's alive. But he had a few good things to say. And one of the things he says, God cannot achieve as God achieved in the first creation by the mere power of command. Let there be light, and there was light. For the new creation, the new creation must come through cooperation. If the person called acts in accord with God's will, then God's grace has free play and creates in the minister and around the minister the new thing, the kingdom. It's almost as though God needs us. It's not like God worked in the past. He set it all up so that divine providence is very important. And the immigration is extremely something that is important to us. We had a visitation, Redemptorists had a visitation from Rome, and one of the consultors said something to me, which, you know, how often you listen to the general consultors, but this was a great phrase. And he was talking about immigration and something that applies to us, and I don't know if it was his words or someone else's, but it made sense. It was, you know, there's a saying, blood is thicker than water. And we know what that means. You know, you side with your relative in many cases. Okay, blood is thicker than water. But he says, you know, for the Christian, it's very important that we do not let the blood of our culture ever become thicker than the water of our baptism. Now, I think that's a marvelous summary of what it means, whether you're John Neumann or any of the early sisters or people working in migrant ministry today, to remember, because it so affects us. The blood of our culture sometimes becomes thicker than the water of our baptism, and we forget that we're Christian. I just want to say then a little bit about the idea of the theology. Our theology, when we talk about immigration, is not just we want to do good. No, it ties in very much with faith-seeking understanding. Okay, so we look at theology and we see, first of all, that from the very beginning, Genesis, very beginning of the Bible, our story of salvation history is a story of immigration and of migration. In that story, Abraham left the homeland, Ur of Chaldees, went to a land of promise, which he did not see, nor did his wife Sarah see fulfilled, completely at least, that they were going to become so numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea, but they lived by faith. And so Sarah and Abraham are our ancestors in the whole history of our faith. And we know that, of course, that it didn't end with that. The history of being exiled into Egypt, the exile, and then the wandering in the desert, the going to the promised land, the exile into the Babylonian captivity, to Assyria. It's a story of the Old Testament of people moving from place to place and being left behind because they no longer have the power of rule in the homeland. And then, of course, we look at our Savior, Jesus Christ, who is the immigrant par excellence. Though he was in the form of God, he did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. Rather, he emptied himself, took the form of a slave, being born in our likeness. He was the great and the greatest of all immigrants. He left the homeland of heaven to come here. And he lived, as we know right from the very beginning, like an immigrant, not able to find a place to live in Bethlehem, being forced to go to Egypt to flee oppression, coming back and trying to get settled again. In the end, he suffered the greatest of all deportations. He was deported by crucifixion and sent away because people did not want him. And so you see, in our very nature, in the very theology of our religion, immigration is not just a thing of a person who did something in the past and we try to imitate it. It's actually the very presence of God active in our lives today. And I like this little quote. This little quote is from a man named David Grody. It was found in America magazine, 2011. I think the name of the article was Migration or something like that. But he said this: more than the factual retrieval, brilliant concepts are propositional truth. See, theology is about engagement of faith with life that heals and empowers as it seeks to discern the fingerprint of God in the common sojourn from creation to new creation. Our very concept as a church is that we are pilgrims. Pilgrims, not in the glorious sense of going from pilgrimage by deluxe bus, but rather the pilgrimage is on a journey to some promised land. And so when we look at John Neumann, we can look at the history of John Neumann and the influence of John Neumann and all of the people, as I'm sure there'll be someone speaking about the input of the foundresses of this particular community, how important it was that they did immigrant work. I mean, that's who they had to work with. That's what we all had to work with in those days. But rather, our theology is not some kind of a thing where we put it in a textbook and we study it. Our theology, as this man said, is finding the fingerprint of God in life. And that is found in the story of people, and the story of our church is a story of migration and immigration. So it ties in very much with our history, our roots, and our whole story, and it ties in with what we are called upon in the providence of God today. What is God telling us? What do we have to do for the kingdom? Because God needs us, and that's how it works. So I think that's about the end of my time. I thank you for this opportunity to be with you.